The sound hit the German sentries first, 60 Kukris sliding from their sheaths in perfect unison. Like silk being torn, they said later. Those who lived to say anything at all. 400 feet below, Major Kleinmet was laughing. The British had finally lost their minds, sending 5-foot-tall mountain men against Monte Cassino's sheer cliff face. Physics didn't work that way. Gravity didn't care about your empire or your little curved knives. The cliff was a wall, straight up. 400 feet of limestone that mountain goats wouldn't attempt. Even the Americans had looked at it and walked away. But there they were in the darkness. 60 Nepalese soldiers with 60 pounds of kit each, moving up the rock like they were climbing stairs. Kleinmet stopped laughing around hour 3. By dawn, 60 Gurkhas sat motionless on a 15-foot ledge, 50 yards from German breakfast positions. 7 hours and 25 minutes of climbing. Not a sound, not a pebble disturbed. German soldiers buttered their bread and drank ersatz coffee, completely unaware that death was having breakfast with them. The mountain men had done the impossible. Again. They came from the hills of Nepal, villages where the air was thin and the ground was vertical, where boys learned to move on rock faces before they learned to read, where the nearest lowland town was 3 days of climbing away and the weather could kill you faster than any enemy. The British found them in 1815 after getting their teeth kicked in by these same mountain fighters during the Anglo-Nepalese War. Smart money says if you can't beat them, recruit them, give them a uniform, point them at your enemies. Then step back and watch the magic happen. But magic isn't the right word. Magic suggests something supernatural. This was training. This was genetics. This was 10,000 years of evolution in terrain that would kill most people just by existing. Villages in Nepal weren't built on flat ground. There wasn't any. Everything was vertical. Every journey was a climb. Every approach required techniques that lowland armies had never needed to develop. Children grew up treating sheer rock faces the way English children treated cobblestone streets. Something you moved across without thinking about, without fear, without hesitation. The result was a population that had been naturally filtered by one of the harshest environments on Earth. Every man who made it to recruiting age had already survived challenges that would break lowland soldiers. The altitude alone was selection pressure. The terrain was selection pressure. The winters were selection pressure. By the time a young man from the hills of Nepal stood in front of a British recruiting officer, he had already passed a test that most of the world's soldiers would never face. The Kukri wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool, a statement, a promise. The curve wasn't aesthetic, it was physics. The weight distribution let a 5-foot man generate the force to cleave through bone. The angle turned every strike into a combination of cut and pull. The notch near the hilt traditionally said to catch dripping blood and keep it from the handle. Practically speaking, it was the signature of a weapons culture that spent centuries refining the most effective possible tool for close-quarters killing in terrain where rifles jammed and artillery couldn't follow. Devastating doesn't begin to cover it. German intelligence files from 1943 describe them as otherworldly. That's German efficiency talking. No emotion, just clinical observation. When Germans start using words like otherworldly, you know something has broken their understanding of how war works. The British brass never quite got it either. They saw small men with curved knives and thought primitive. They missed the point entirely. These weren't primitive warriors. These were specialists, mountain warfare specialists who had been perfecting their craft since before Rome was a city. The recruitment process was brutal. Out of thousands who applied, only a handful made it through. They had to run up mountains, carry impossible loads, fight with their bare hands. Most broke. The ones who didn't break became legends. Training was where the friction started. British officers looked at these hill fighters and saw soldiers who needed civilizing. Modern weapons, proper tactics, European discipline. They missed the point entirely. The Gurkhas had been fighting in vertical terrain for centuries. They knew things about war that weren't in any manual. How to move without sound. How to appear where physics said they couldn't. How to turn the enemy's strength into weakness. Major Vivian Weatherall understood. He spoke Gurkhali. He listened. Then they replaced him with Major George Dunlop, who didn't speak a word of it. Every order needed translation. Every decision filtered through British assumptions about what was possible and what was suicide. And then came Monte Cassino. The Germans had picked their position well. Mountain fortress, commanding views, approaches covered by interlocking fields of fire. The kind of strong point that could hold up an army for months. They'd made one mistake. They assumed that a 400-foot sheer cliff was a wall. To the Gurkhas, it was just another trail. Colonel Harrison and Brigade HQ had a problem. The Gurkhas kept insisting they could climb it, not requesting permission, stating intent, like they were discussing the weather. "It's suicide," Harrison told them. "We need modern weapons, artillery support, airstrikes, not some primitive mountain climbing expedition." The Gurkhas nodded politely and started preparing their ropes. Except there were no ropes, no pitons, no modern climbing gear. Just hands and feet, and the knowledge passed down through generations of hill fighters who treated vertical terrain like other men treated roads. Major Climate had spent 3 years building defenses on that cliff, interlocking fields of fire, machine gun positions with perfect sight lines, artillery coordinates pre-calculated for every possible approach route, every possible approach except straight up a vertical rock face, because that was impossible. The climbing started at 2100 hours, 60 men, full combat load, ammunition, weapons, radio equipment, medical supplies, food and water for 3 days, 60 pounds per man minimum, moving in complete darkness, no ropes, no pitons, no modern climbing gear, just hands and feet, and knowledge. Hour 2. The sounds reached Kleinmith's sentries, scraping, like fingernails on stone, but amplified, systematic. Hour 3, the sounds stopped. Complete silence. Kleinmith sent a patrol to check the base of the cliff. They found scuff marks on the limestone, boot prints in the dirt. Nothing more. "Sir," the sergeant reported, "it looks like they started climbing." Kleinmith stared at the vertical wall. 400 feet of smooth rock, disappearing into darkness above. "That's impossible." "Yes, sir." But impossible was a word the mountain men had never learned to pronounce properly. Dawn broke at 0530 hours. Golden light crept across the Italian landscape, illuminating German breakfast positions, guard posts, supply depots, routine morning activities in what everyone believed was an impregnable fortress. 50 yards away, 60 Gurkhas sat motionless on a 15-foot ledge. 7 hours and 25 minutes of climbing. Not one pebble disturbed, not one sound made. Invisible in plain sight. They watched German soldiers butter bread and drink coffee. Watched them clean weapons and read letters from home. Watched them live their last peaceful moments without knowing death was sharing their morning meal. The assault signal came at 0600 hours. 60 Kukris cleared their sheaths with that same silk-tearing sound. But this time, the Germans heard it clearly. The first German soldier to die never knew what hit him. He was warming his hands over a small fire when the Kukri took his head clean off. No sound, no warning, just the brief, wet whisper of steel through flesh. The psychological impact was immediate. These weren't artillery rounds or bullets. This was personal, intimate, the kind of killing that required getting close enough to smell your enemy's breakfast. Climate heard the reports coming in over the radio. Fragmentary, panicked, impossible. His positions were being overrun. From behind, from above, from directions that his engineers had assured him were physically inaccessible. He grabbed his binoculars and ran to the observation post. What he saw changed his understanding of warfare forever. 60 men in brown uniforms moving through his positions like they owned them. Small men, Asian features, carrying curved blades that caught the morning light and reflected it back in brief, silver flashes. Each flash marked another of his soldiers dying, not being killed. Dying. There was a difference. Being killed was mechanical, industrial. Dying was personal. The Gurkhas moved like water. When they hit resistance, they flowed around it. When they found weakness, they exploited it. They didn't advance in lines. They didn't follow doctrine. They followed instinct. And their instinct was flawless. 3 years of German defensive preparation rendered useless in 30 seconds. Not by superior firepower or better tactics, by superior spirit applied to impossible terrain. The surrender came at 04:12 hours. 25 minutes after the first shot was fired, not because the Germans were cowards, because they were professionals. And professionals recognize when they've been beaten by something beyond their understanding. Kleinmitt walked out of his bunker with his hands raised. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing erect. But his eyes held something new. Recognition. The acknowledgement that everything he thought he knew about warfare had just been proven wrong by 60 men who treated impossible like a job description. Later, in the prisoner compound, Kleinmitt tried to explain to British intelligence officers what had happened. How 60 men had done what the laws of physics said couldn't be done. I was not defeated by superior force, he said finally. I was not defeated by better weapons, or more men, or superior tactics. I was defeated by superior spirit. The intelligence officers wrote it down, another data point in the growing file on Gurkha capabilities, another impossible thing that had somehow become possible. By June 1944, German tactical guides included detailed sections on Gurkha infiltration methods. Standing orders assumed any vertical surface under 500 feet was climbable at night. Defense positions were redesigned to account for enemies who could appear where geometry said they couldn't exist. The institutionalization of fear, written into military doctrine by men who had watched the impossible become routine. But the most telling change came from German surrender protocols. Officers began capitulating with a specific phrase. We will not wait for you to climb our walls. We prefer to live. The reputation had become more powerful than the reality. Though the reality was terrifying enough. Juryman Ray stood 5 feet 2 inches in his boots, 120 pounds with full equipment, a muleteer by training, a man who had pestered for exciting duties until someone finally said, yes. Burma, 1944. The jungle war where distance was measured in yards and survival in minutes, where the enemy appeared and disappeared like smoke, where conventional tactics went to die in the green hell of tropical warfare. Rai's unit was moving through secondary jungle when the contact came. 5 Japanese soldiers, regular infantry, combat veterans who had been fighting since the war began. They had the high ground. They had prepared positions. They had everything except luck. The firefight lasted 2 minutes. Rai killed 3 with his rifle. Standard British point, 303. Aimed shots. Center mass. Professional work. But 3 enemy soldiers were still alive. Still shooting. Still dangerous. Time for the Kukri. The first Japanese soldier never saw him coming. Rai moved through the undergrowth like liquid shadow. The curved blade took the man cleanly. No hesitation. No wasted motion. The second soldier turned at the sound, brought his rifle around, almost got a shot off. The Kukri opened him from sternum to spine. He dropped, still trying to work the bolt. 2 minutes, 5 enemy dead. Juryman Rai standing in the middle of it all with 5 bullet holes in his uniform and not a scratch on his skin. His officer found him field stripping the Japanese weapons, sorting ammunition, preparing to move on to the next contact. Like killing 5 men in 2 minutes was just another item on the day's checklist. Casualties? The officer asked. Rai pointed to the holes in his uniform. 5 near misses, Sahib. Wounds? None, Sahib. The officer looked at the bodies, at the scene, at the evidence of what had happened in this little patch of jungle. Professional soldiers killed by a man who had been a muleteer 6 months earlier. Killed by superior tactics, superior training, superior spirit, but mostly killed by the absolute refusal to accept that 5 against 1 were bad odds. Each level of command that reviewed Rai's combat report added their own analysis. Their own attempt to understand how a 120-pound muleteer had single-handedly eliminated an enemy squad. The conclusion was always the same: training, equipment, tactics, but mostly something that couldn't be quantified. The mentality that treated impossible as just another word for Tuesday. Rai survived Burma, survived the war, went back to Nepal and became a farmer, raised children, grew old, died quietly in his sleep, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew that their gentle grandfather had once been 5 feet 2 inches of concentrated fury. The Japanese soldiers he killed never got the chance to grow old. Their war ended in a patch of secondary jungle at the hands of a man who had pestered for exciting duties and got exactly what he asked for. Naik Premsing Gurung lay under the teak tree with his thigh bone in 5 pieces and his mind perfectly clear. The morphine hadn't touched the clarity. Nothing could touch that. His unit was moving out. 12 lives depending on speed and stealth. 12 men who would die if they stayed to carry 1 wounded soldier through enemy territory. The mathematics were simple, brutal, inescapable. Burma, 1943. Behind Japanese lines. A patrol that had gone wrong in the way that patrols always went wrong when you were operating in the enemy's backyard with no support and no way home except through 100 miles of hostile jungle. Gurung's leg was finished. The bone had shattered when he took the fall. Compound fracture, multiple breaks. Even with immediate medical attention, he'd be lucky to keep the leg. Out here, with nothing but field dressings and morphine, he was dead weight. His lieutenant knelt beside him. Young officer, good man, trying to figure out how to save everyone when the mathematics said it couldn't be done. "We can carry you," the lieutenant said. "No, Sahib. We can build a stretcher." "No, Sahib." The conversation went on for 5 minutes. Each suggestion met with the same quiet refusal. Gurung knew the score, had known it from the moment he felt the bone snap. This was where his war ended. "Give me a rifle," he said finally. The lieutenant wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but Gurung's eyes held the same certainty that had carried his people through 1,000 years of mountain warfare. The absolute acceptance that sometimes the math was simple and brutal and had to be faced. They traded weapons. Gurung's Thompson submachine gun for a standard rifle, more accurate, better for what came next. The lieutenant understood without being told. Sometimes the last service you could perform was to die quietly and take as many of the enemy with you as possible. "Goodbye, Sahib," Gurung said. The patrol moved out, 12 men disappearing into the jungle, leaving 1 behind to hold the line that couldn't be held, to buy time that couldn't be bought, to die alone so that others might live. Gurung settled against the teak tree and checked his rifle. Full magazine. 1 in the chamber. Enough for what needed to be done. He could hear the Japanese moving through the undergrowth, following the trail, getting closer. The single shot came 20 minutes later. Sharp crack echoing through the jungle. Then silence. The kind of absolute quiet that meant the mathematics had been completed. The equation balanced. 1 life spent to save 12. The patrol made it back to British lines 3 days later. The lieutenant would spend the rest of his life wondering if there had been another way. If the mathematics could have been different, if one man's sacrifice had been necessary or just convenient. But Gurung had never wondered, had never doubted. The decision had been clear from the moment the bone snapped. His war was ending under a teak tree in enemy territory. His brother's war would continue because he had chosen to end his properly. The sound of silk being torn, the whisper of honor meeting mathematics. The final lesson in why the small, quiet men with curved blades understood that sometimes the greatest victory was knowing when to die well. Burma wasn't just the Gurkhas' war. It was their laboratory. Dense jungle, monsoon rains, terrain that swallowed entire divisions. Perfect conditions for the mountain men to do what they did best: hunt humans. The Japanese had studied the Gurkhas, respected them in the way that warriors respect other warriors who have mastered their craft. German intelligence called them otherworldly. Japanese prisoner reports used different language. Curved knife devils. Men who moved through the jungle like the jungle was afraid of them. The Japanese made the same mistake the Germans made. They assumed that superior numbers and prepared positions could compensate for what the Gurkhas brought to close combat. They learned the same lesson, slower, because the jungle swallowed mistakes that limestone cliffs put on immediate display. But they learned it just as completely. Lieutenant Ian McCorton described the fighting at Koyakthan, the close combat of bayonet and Kukri, the fanatical, personal slaughter with blood dripping cold steel. Modern warfare reduced to its most primitive elements: man against man, steel against steel, will against will. The Gurkhas won. They always won, even when they lost. The Japanese started using captured Gurkhas as slave labor, not because they were broken, because they were skilled muleteers who could carry impossible loads through impossible terrain. Even as prisoners, they were useful in ways the Japanese couldn't replicate. But the Japanese made a mistake. They underestimated what desperation could do to men who already lived outside normal human limits. The psychological reports coming out of the Pacific Theater were consistent with what German officers were describing in Italy. Veterans breaking down, not from combat losses, but from the fear of facing an enemy that seemed to ignore the basic rules of warfare. Who treated impossible as just another tactical consideration? Who could appear where the map said no human could go? German intelligence was running their own analysis in parallel. The reports kept coming in from Italy, from Burma, from wherever these Nepalese soldiers appeared. The impossible became routine. Positions fell that should have held. Approaches were used that shouldn't have existed. Soldiers died in ways that defied explanation. Colonel Weber sat at German tactical headquarters in occupied France and stared at the document on his desk. Modification to Field Manual, 740. Section on Unconventional Infantry Tactics. Subsection, Gurkha Infiltration Methods. He'd been writing military doctrine for 15 years. This was different. This wasn't theory. This wasn't projection based on observed capabilities. This was adaptation based on fear. The manual was explicit. Any vertical surface under 500 feet should be considered climbable at night. All defensive positions must account for approach routes that appeared physically impossible. Sentries must be positioned to observe improbable angles of approach. Weber had fought on 3 fronts. He'd seen Soviets in winter, Americans with their industrial might, British with their stubborn professionalism. None of them had required rewriting the laws of physics in the tactical manual. He'd interviewed survivors from Monte Cassino, professional soldiers, men with years of combat experience. They all told the same story. Positions that were secure became death traps. Walls became highways. The impossible became inevitable. They don't fight like soldiers, one sergeant had reported. They fight like something else. Like they've been doing this for 1,000 years. Like modern warfare is just another variation on something they already knew. The intelligence analysis was even more disturbing. These weren't supermen. Medical examinations of captured Gurkhas showed average physical capabilities, average strength, average endurance. The only difference was training, and something else. Something that didn't show up in medical reports. Mentality. The absolute refusal to accept that something couldn't be done simply because it appeared impossible. The ingrained assumption that every obstacle was just another problem to be solved. The cultural background that treated vertical terrain as normal. Weber finished the manual update and filed it with High Command. 6 months later, every German unit in every theater had received copies. Standing orders to assume that any defensive position could be bypassed by routes that conventional tactics considered unusable. The war was being fought with tanks and planes and artillery. Industrial warfare on an unprecedented scale. But it was being changed by 60 men with curved knives who had learned to walk on walls. Weber's final report to High Command was classified at the highest levels. Too disturbing for general circulation. Too precise to be dismissed as propaganda. The conclusion was simple and terrifying. The enemy possessed capabilities that exceeded conventional understanding of human limitations in mountain terrain. The German army was adapting, learning, evolving their tactics to account for an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal parameters of military science. But adaptation meant acknowledgement. And acknowledgement meant that something fundamental had changed in how warfare worked. October 1944. Northern Italy. The Gothic line was breaking down in sections, not from artillery, not from armor, but from the simple knowledge that walls weren't walls anymore. That defensive positions had become elaborate traps waiting to be sprung by men who walked on vertical surfaces. The German officer walked out with his hands raised and his dignity intact. His uniform was clean, his bearing military. But his eyes held the look of a man who had seen the future and decided he didn't like it. "We will not wait for you to climb our walls," he said. "We prefer to live." The psychological warfare was complete. The reputation had spread through the German army like a virus. Every defensive position was compromised by possibility. Every wall was a potential highway. Every cliff face an approach route for ghosts who moved at night and killed with curved steel. Intelligence reports showed the pattern across multiple theaters. German units requesting transfers away from mountain warfare. Officers refusing assignments to elevated positions. Entire defensive plans being rewritten to account for approaches that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The Gurkhas had broken more than defensive lines. They had broken the German army's understanding of physics, of military geography, of the basic assumption that some things were simply impossible. Unit cohesion was fracturing, not from combat losses, but from fear. The kind of deep psychological terror that came from facing an enemy who seemed to exist outside the normal rules of warfare, who treated impossible as just another tactical consideration. "How do you defend against ghosts?" the German officer asked during interrogation. The British officer smiled. "You don't. You surrender. And if we hadn't, then you would have woken up dead." The surrender at the Gothic line wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. The acknowledgement that fighting an enemy who ignored the laws of physics was a losing proposition. That military engineering meant nothing when your opponents had spent 10,000 years learning to walk on walls. That officer had fought on 3 fronts: Russia, North Africa, Italy. He had seen the best and worst of modern warfare. But he had never seen anything like the Gurkhas, never faced soldiers who treated sheer cliffs like highways, and impossibility like a personal challenge. The war ended. The industrial might of the Allies ground German resistance into powder. But in the mountains of Italy, it ended for a different reason. Because 60 men with curved blades had proven that some things were more powerful than technology. more enduring than doctrine, more terrifying than death. The legend didn't end with the war. It couldn't, because the mountain men kept proving the same point in every conflict that followed. Korea, the Falklands, Afghanistan, different terrain, different enemies, same result. There's a pattern to how enemies encounter the Gurkhas for the first time. First comes the dismissal. Small men, light weapons, no armor, no artillery of their own. How much trouble could they possibly be? Then comes the contact. Brief, violent, completely unlike anything in the opposing commander's experience. Then comes the report. Fragmentary at first, confused, reaching for language that doesn't exist yet for what just happened. And finally comes the adaptation. The rewriting of standing orders, the requests for additional sentries, the tactical manuals updated to account for enemies who operate outside the expected parameters of warfare. Every army that fought the Gurkhas went through this sequence. Some went through it faster than others. The Germans needed Monte Cassino and 6 months of subsequent encounters before the tactical manuals were updated. The Japanese needed Burma. The Taliban needed rooftops in Afghanistan. The sequence was always the same. The result was always the same. The Gurkha story is not really about warfare. Warfare is just the context. The story is about what humans are capable of when they have been shaped by an environment that doesn't permit weakness. When their culture has built a framework around honor and sacrifice that makes death in service of your brothers not a tragedy, but a fulfillment. When the impossible has never been a barrier, because the terrain you grew up on was already impossible by every standard the lowland world applies. Sergeant Dipersad Pun proved it in Afghanistan. 17 minutes on a rooftop against 15 to 30 Taliban fighters. He used his rifle until it jammed, his pistol until it emptied, grenades until the supply ran out, a sandbag as a thrown weapon until the sand fell out. Finally, the machine gun tripod as a club. "I thought before they kill me, I have to kill some of them," he said later. Then, shouting at the remaining attackers, "I will kill you all." They believed him. The ones still alive retreated. The mountain men had that effect on people. They made the impossible seem inevitable, made death seem like a reasonable career choice compared to facing them in close combat. 5 feet 2 inches of fury with 18 inches of curved steel. That was the mathematics of Gurkha warfare. The numbers never added up until the fighting was over. Then they added up perfectly. Lieutenant Stuart Jones was greatly annoyed that his Gurkhas were returned to their original rank and pay after the war. No recognition, no medals, no acknowledgement that they had consistently achieved the impossible against impossible odds. The bureaucracy didn't understand what they had witnessed. Brigadier Nelson Russell did. "I hope these countless duffs will be remembered," he wrote, referring to the Gurkha soldiers who had redefined what human beings could accomplish when spirit met steel. They are remembered. In German tactical manuals, in Japanese prisoner reports, in Taliban propaganda warnings about the curved knife devils. They are remembered every time someone says something is impossible. The mountain men never learned that word properly. They climbed walls at night instead. There's something in the Gurkha story that sits outside normal military history. Most war stories are about technology, about numbers, about the grinding mathematics of industrial conflict. This one is about something else entirely. Something that made German engineers rewrite their defensive manuals, and Japanese commanders take captured soldiers as skilled labor rather than execute them. Something that made hardened veterans wake up in cold sweats years after the fighting ended. The British found them because they couldn't beat them. That's the part that gets buried in the recruitment mythology. The Anglo-Nepalese War of 1814 to 1816 was supposed to be a short, punitive campaign by the most powerful empire on earth against a small Himalayan kingdom. It wasn't. The mountain fighters of Nepal forced the British East India Company to negotiate, to acknowledge that some terrain and some soldiers operated by different rules. So they did what empires do. They co-opted the threat, offered uniforms and wages and the chance to fight in wars that had nothing to do with the hills of Nepal. And the Gurkhas said yes, not for British imperial ambitions, for the same reason they'd always fought, for each other, for the honor code that had been carved into them by 10,000 years of living where the ground was vertical and weakness meant death. The Kukri is part of the package deal, 18 inches of forward curved steel with a weight distribution that turns the physics of a slash into something closer to an axe blow. The notch near the hilt, traditionally said to catch dripping blood and keep it from the handle. Practically speaking, it's the signature of a weapons culture that spent centuries refining the most effective possible tool for close-quarters killing in terrain where rifles jammed and artillery couldn't follow. But the Kukri is just metal. The man behind it is something else entirely. The training that's selected for the man who would carry it was elimination on a scale that makes modern special forces selection look like a suggestion. Villages across Nepal sent their strongest young men. The ones who survived the selection process were the ones whose ancestors had survived the same process for generations. Natural selection with a military application. The result was something that didn't show up in any medical examination and couldn't be quantified by any intelligence assessment. The willingness to close distance when everything in human biology is screaming to run. The ability to perform complex physical tasks in complete darkness on vertical terrain while carrying 60 pounds of equipment. The cultural framework that treated death in service of your brothers as a reasonable and honorable outcome. Naik Premsing. Gurung said goodbye to his lieutenant under a teak tree because the mathematics were simple. 12 men needed to live more than one man needed to survive. The decision wasn't heroic in the way that military citations describe heroism. It was practical, clear-eyed. The application of a moral framework that prioritized the group over the individual in a way that European officers found both inspiring and incomprehensible. "I hope these countless duffs will be remembered," wrote Brigadier Russell. But the bureaucracy returned them to their original ranks and pay scales because the bureaucracy measured things in units that didn't have a column for men who climbed 400 feet of vertical limestone in complete darkness, while carrying 60 pounds of equipment, and then waited motionless for 7 hours before killing with more efficiency than anything the industrial age had produced. Major Kleinmitt tried for the rest of his life to explain what happened at Monte Cassino, to intelligence officers, to historians, to anyone who would listen. The words never seemed adequate. Years later, in his memoirs, he wrote the only sentence that came close. "I was not defeated by superior force. I was not defeated by better equipment or tactics. I was defeated by superior spirit. By men who had transformed the impossible into the inevitable through sheer force of will." The sound of silk being torn. 60 blades that had rewritten the rules of mountain warfare and changed one German officer's understanding of what human beings were capable of when they refused to accept limitations. Some things, once broken, can never be repaired. The German army's faith in the impossible was shattered by men who climbed walls at night and killed with ancient steel in a modern world. And in the end, even the Germans preferred to live in a world where impossible was just another word for Tuesday. Where walls were highways, and cliffs were approach routes, and small men with curved blades ruled the vertical battlefield with absolute, terrifying competence. The legend was complete, written in blood and steel and the mathematics of fear. 60 men who had changed warfare forever by refusing to accept that anything was impossible. The mountains of Nepal are still there, still vertical, still teaching the same lessons they've always taught. That weakness is death, that the obstacle is the route, that the impossible is just another problem that hasn't been solved yet. The British found the Gurkhas in 1815 because they couldn't beat them. The Germans rewrote their tactical manuals because they couldn't stop them. The Japanese used them as slave labor because, even captured, they were more capable than soldiers who had spent their entire lives on flat ground. And somewhere in the hills of Nepal, boys are still learning to move on rock faces before they learn to read. Still inheriting 10,000 years of the same hard knowledge. Still carrying the cultural memory of what happens when you send 60 men up a 400-foot cliff face in complete darkness with 60 pounds of equipment each, and the absolute conviction that physics is a guideline rather than a law. The sound of silk being torn. The most terrifying sound in the German army's collective memory. The sound of certainty being shattered. The whisper of steel through flesh. The voice of inevitable defeat for anyone who ever made the mistake of assuming that the small, quiet men with courage